Welcome to the Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast, hosting insightful conversations with fascinating people to shape the way that Britain interacts with the world. In this episode, I continue my conversation with Aline Burni, focusing on her home country of Brazil. It seems a fitting time for this episode, following President Lula of Brazil's enthusiastic congratulations of the new UK Labour government and his hopes for a strengthened relationship between the two countries. So we're going to come on to part two. We're moving on to talk about Brazil. If you haven't listened to part one on the EU that I did with Aline in the previous podcast episode, I would very much recommend it. We're moving on to Brazil. And Aline, if you could just reintroduce yourself for people joining us for this episode and tell us about your connection to Brazil, of course, within that.
Sure. So I'm actually originally from Brazil. This is where I grew up and I did most of my training there. I'm a political scientist by training. I did my PhD at the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. But as we were discussing, I've always had a bit of one foot in Brazil, one foot in Europe. I've always been interested in European politics. But I also have an experience in Brazil. I've worked there for the state government of Minas Gerais with international relations, international partnerships in the Secretariat for Science, Technology and Higher Education. And I also worked with international cooperation for an NGO based in Washington, D.C. called Pixera Global. And I supported them in implementing a global social responsibility program in my hometown, Belo Horizonte. And this was a fascinating experience in which supported the achievement of SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, at the local level. It was super interesting experience. So this is my connection to Brazil. I'm actually from Brazil and have lived most of my life there and done part of my work and most of my studies there.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to have you talk about Brazil because you really have, as you say, got one foot in Brazil and one foot in Europe, and that gives you a really interesting perspective, I think. I want to jump in straight away and I want to get your take on Brazil's current position in the world and other countries' reactions to that.
Well, we're now under a third term of Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil since 2023. Before that, we had Jair Bolsonaro, who you might remember as well. And Bolsonaro was very much described as someone who was changing the relationships of Brazil and the role of Brazil in the world. So under Bolsonaro, Brazil was very much seen and approached as a pariah. Because he really changed a lot of the traditional foreign policy and the structure of Brazilian foreign policy. There were lots of setbacks in this sector in Brazil. So Lula came in 2023 with this promise to bring Brazil back to the world stage, and he has invested a lot on it. He has traveled around the world. He has spent a lot of his time visiting other countries in all regions, really based and driven on this universalist principle of Brazilian foreign policy, which means that Brazil wants to keep channels open with everybody and not be aligned with only one or a few powers in the world. And I think he has at the same time recovered some of the principles that traditionally drove Brazilian foreign policy. So, for example, as I mentioned, the universalist tradition, this interest to focus on South-South cooperation and put Brazil as not only a regional player, but also as a global player representing the so-called Global South. He also recovered important and very fundamental agendas on the development cooperation space. So he puts a lot of emphasis on the need to fight poverty and hunger and inequalities globally. And of course, he supports the multilateral system. But Lula also has expressed, and this is not in this only in this term, but this is also an agenda that comes from a long time, from a Brazilian perspective. He supports reforms in the multilateral system. And finally, I think what's been very strong in this new phase of Brazilian foreign policy is the priority of the climate agenda. So Brazil really sees itself as playing a major role in the governance around climate change and in providing solutions to the climate crisis.
Yeah, this is great. I really want to unpack this because essentially what you're saying is traditionally Brazilian foreign policy, particularly shaped by Lula and now brought back by Lula, and we'll get into the last few years before that in a second, but that it has a very strong sense of values and what that approach looks like. And what's so interesting is that sits in the middle of quite a geopolitical polarized world right now, where most countries are having to decide how they relate to the US, how they relate to China, where they stand on different global issues. And so there's lots of decisions for country to make. We talk a lot about transactional geopolitics. And yet you're saying the Brazilian approach is actually different to that. And that actually explains, I think, some of how Brazil is managing to navigate in the world at the moment. But how, from a Brazilian perspective, do you see that working? Or unpack that a little bit more for us.
I think that indeed sometimes this is misinterpreted by some countries in the world because precisely Brazil, as other countries in Latin America, they are opting for what is called an active non-alignment. So they are no longer choosing sides, but they are also reflecting on positions that take into account their own national interests and their traditions and principles and values in foreign policy as well. So this means that they will not always align with the West or the other or that, but it also means that not aligning with the West doesn't mean that they are aligning with the other side, right? With what some have put together as authoritarian powers. So I think seeing things through these bipolar lenses doesn't work to understand the positioning of countries like Brazil, because it's really anchored on a broader and more complex, I would say, reasoning. Because of course, there are values involved, but there are also commercial trade relations. China is an important trade partner for Brazil, and Brazil cannot afford and is not interested in cutting relationships with a country like China. But of course, that this decision and this active non-alignment doesn't come without challenges. There has been challenges. I think Lula has made some faux pas, as we say. So he committed some gaffe at some certain points. So when, for example, I think in all the major conflicts that we are seeing, Russia against Ukraine, I think he was very ambiguous at some points of the conflict, but he still puts Brazil forward as a potential mediator in this conflict. But sometimes it has been interpreted as much more pro-Putin position than neutral or mediator position. Same has happened around Gaza. I think he also made some rhetorical mistakes there when he talked about genocide and so on. I think sometimes there are also some domestic political dynamics that influence those positioning. So, of course, there are sectors in the Workers' Party, the left-wing party of Lula, who are more anti-American, might be more favorable to Putin. So I think he kind of suffers the pressures from different political actors internally as well. But as a whole, the position of Brazil is really to keep channels open with everybody, consider its national interests as well, and be guided by principles that have been part of its foreign policy for quite a long time, and to try to play a more to play the role of a more global player and not only regional player. And one way it has been doing this is by promoting these reforms of the multilateral system, and also by driving the G20 agenda. This year, Brazil is leading the G20, is hosting the G20, and Lula is really using this to put forward this agenda that I mentioned, focusing on fighting hunger, inequality, poverty, and also promoting a more democratic and balanced multilateral system that can reflect the changes that the world has been through, and the new distribution of power in the world. So he also invests a lot on the BRICS, and it doesn't mean that the objective here is to deconstruct or go against the West, but it's really about providing new channels of interaction, especially for these emerging powers, and to push for different arrangements in the traditional multilateral institutions that Brazil really sees as not reflecting the current state of the world.
That's so interesting. Right. I love the way you've just really emphasized around wanting to invest and reform the multilateral system at the same time as the BRICS, and that being about opening up channels. And I think this is such an important perspective for people to grasp who are looking at Brazil from the outside. For me, it's really interesting because it sits very well, I think, with Brazil's history around the fact that it is a very large. I was always struck when I visited and lived there for a while that it was such a large country that did an incredible job of uniting everyone together to feel that like we are all Brazilians. I remember this is a while ago, but there were TV adverts all the time showing different parts of the country, different people, but united together as one Brazil, all Brazilians. And it's interesting to think about foreign policy actually reflecting almost some of the approach that it took previously to unite such a diverse and large geographical country. But of course, so moving on to that domestic side, the Bolsonaro period was actually quite a shake-up and quite a shock domestically, wasn't it? And so just tell us about how that has felt domestically in Brazil for the last period, and then also now, what does it look like domestically?
I would start by saying that actually this Bolsonaro era is not over, because Brazil remains very polarized, quite a divided country. And let's remember that Lula gained for a small margin. It was not a major victory. And the most important, and we see the impact of this lingering now, the Congress is very right-leaning, very conservative. I think it's one of the most conservative Congresses, parliaments in that Brazil has had. So this means that Lula has had a very difficult, challenging time to govern. I think there's a lot going on domestically at the moment, and this has captured the attention of Lula for the moment. We see he's been doing a bit less appearances externally, because there's lots going on internally, majorly in two fronts. So one is the economic agenda. Brazil is going through some challenging fiscal reforms, so it's been very hard to find agreements with the parliament to pass reforms and so on. And on the other side, you have some sectors of the Workers' Party that wouldn't like to see austerity measures being taken by this government. But at the same time, this is a government that needs to build coalitions. Let me quickly go through how the Brazilian political system works. So you have a president who is elected for a fixed term, and this is also a country that has almost 30 parties, and you have more than 15 parties represented in the parliament. So the president, although he is elected directly by an absolute majority, often he doesn't have a majority or a natural majority in the parliament. So he has to build coalitions, he has to build majorities, and share the power, share the government with other parties. And this time, precisely to beat Bolsonaro, Lula had to build a very broad coalition, a very heterogeneous coalition, what they called a broader front. And this involves alliances with more centrist parties as well. But this has shown challenging to manage and to pass legislation, because you also have a very strong conservative, far right, even resistance or group of parliamentarians in the opposition. So in one front, there's a lot happening around these economic issues, around fiscal measures, reforms, and so on. And on the other side, you have things going on the social cultural agenda as well. So what's recently on the agenda is a very controversial bill around abortion rights. So abortion is already not legalized in Brazil, but the conservatives MPs, they try to pass on an emergency measure, a legislation that would make a punishment for women who commit abortion even stricter than it is already. And this has caused a lot of alarm and mobilization in the society. I think but at the same time, the conservative forces are trying to frame this as a pro-life or pro-abortion discussion, while we're not talking about legalizing abortion at all. It's really about tougher penalties for women who commit abortion, which is already not illegal. So it's a very absurd, very polemic and polarizing, again, discussion. It's going on. It's still going on. So I can't tell you at this point what's going to happen. But what we've seen is that the country is still polarized, and on the one side, you have these conservative forces still relying a lot and playing a lot on these social cultural issues. But on the other side, you also have very strong social movements and social mobilization that is also paying attention and exerting its checks and balances on what's coming from the political class. And finally, well, we have municipal elections, local elections in Brazil in October. So this will also serve as a sort of thermometer to measure the balance of power in Brazil. We've just had these big floodings in the southern part of Brazil, which has caused a lot of mobilization in the country as well. It has also been politicized, unfortunately, because of this polarized, divided framework of the country. And I would, to finalize, I would add that I think that the climate agenda has not achieved as much as the ambitions of Lula and his government would have wished for. And one part of the explanation is this presence of right-wing conservative forces in the Congress that still push for exploration of oil production and is not very keen on strengthening climate policy. So it has been challenging, and I think the domestic agenda in terms of climate policies in Brazil has been challenging because Lula also needs to balance the climate environmental aspect with socioeconomic aspects. So this is still a developing country where you have a lot of inequality, you still have poverty. So he really needs to balance these two dimensions in his rhetoric and also in his government and in his actions. This has been challenging, and some initiatives on one side sometimes contradicting the other. So it's a very difficult agenda to juggle. For example, we recently saw some initiatives of the government to make it easier for people to have access to their own cars. So this goes against a more climate-friendly agenda, but is typically the thing that is very hard to and challenging to deal with in a country like Brazil.
Yeah, I was interested there to understand, it's obviously such a big country, but the national mood, I guess, amongst the people, because you've talked about this tradition socially of social action, of standing up for rights of communities, but also, of course, Brazil is well known world over for its optimism, exuberance, carnival, parties, music, and so generally a country that has been upbeat, and yet we have heard, and I remember my Brazilian friends talking to me quite heartbrokenly a few years ago about how divisive the political situation had got, and in the same family there being really quite different views, which sounded more like the US, some mirroring a little bit of the situation in the US. And so yeah, how would you capture the national mood at the moment of Brazil?
I think it's still very divided. The society is still very divided, polarized. There's a lot of usage made by politicians and influential figures of social media. It's a country that uses WhatsApp and Facebook and those social media tools a lot. There has been a lot going on around fake news and whether and how to regulate all this, but there hasn't been a consensus. So it is, I think, in terms of mood, we are maybe talking a bit less about politics, or maybe avoiding to talk about politics. But I think the divisions remain there. And one way it has translated is, I think people hardly have real conversations about different subjects, but it's really about positioning themselves on one side or the other. And it's really, I think it's really similar to what we see in the US. And actually, we see many times some copy pasting of some strategies by far right politicians from the US. They are repeated, they are copy pasted in Brazil. So I think the divisions, unfortunately, are still there, and people tend to take sides. We also have interpreted this way of seeing and engaging with politics as similar to what we live in football in Brazil. Is something very passionate, very intense, but also very polarizing and can be divisive sometimes, even leading to violence. So I think there are lots of emotional attachments to political figures, and it's very hard to break those silos and to open channels for conversations again.
Yeah, that's that's a really useful analogy, actually. The passion, Brazilians' passion for football, and then the passion going into social issues, which, of course, the impact that has when it's really a divided country and divided political differences. Interestingly, of course, demonstrating a very thriving democracy in some sense, which is very much to be celebrated. So just coming to the UK, based on therefore what you've said, both domestically and the Brazilian approach to foreign policy, particularly the one that Lula is showing at the moment, I was wondering what your opinion on a strategic way that Britain should be relating to Brazil is, because Brazil really is such an important player globally right now, and the UK getting that right seems extremely important to me.
I think given that we have Lula in Brazil and a Labour government in the UK, this is good news for Brazil, because I'm sure that Lula tends to get along with most leaders worldwide, but I think this would make the relationship even closer between Brazil and the UK. I would see the climate agenda as a strategic area to cooperate, because I know that the UK is also keen on advancing the climate agenda, the global governance around climate. And of course, Brazil is a key player on this. You cannot talk about climate without involving Brazil. I think Brazil and the UK have a very good cooperation on this field of science, technology, education, and this could be further explored. Brazil has advanced technology and innovative sectors, for example, in the field of agriculture, health, biotechnology, and I think those would be also interesting avenues to explore in terms of further collaboration. And I think for Brazil, it's really important, as I mentioned, not to come with this understanding of divided word and either you are on the one side or the other, but really approach Brazil with a more genuine interest in terms of understanding its own national priorities, its own interests in the global sphere. And I think it's important to, not judge those positions of Brazil from either alignment with one side or the other. So it's important to understand the rationality behind those positions. And of course, I think for Brazil, it's always interesting to have global players supporting and showing the support for reforming the multilateral system. And the UK is, of course, central in this discussion.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And so really looking at the approach to Brazil being one of openness and really seeking to understand the positions that it's coming with, finding those aligned sectors, and that the multilateral system can be a key area for collaboration. I think you're absolutely right that as the UK goes into a new political era, is a real opportunity to strengthen those ties and to use those aligned values to build something even stronger. And you've of course mentioned that Brazil very much is a global player, but also, of course, it's very significant on the Latin American continent. And so a strong relationship with Brazil is important for the wider continent as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
So just to finish, is there anything that you would like to highlight as a last input in terms of what people really shouldn't miss about Brazil and Brazil in the world?
I would say that Brazil is really a land of contrasts, right? We were speaking about the divisions, but at the same time, the enthusiasm, the joy behind the Brazilian society. But for me, it's really a country of contrasts that coexist. So not only in terms of geography, it's a place that is super diverse. You have the sea, you have mountains, you have the more inland parts of Brazil that have a very rich nature as well. You also have very contrasting urban spaces. So you can see very poor regions in Brazil with levels of human development who can be compared to the poorest countries in the world. And at the same time, you have super rich cities or neighborhoods in cities that are really wealthy and compared to the richest places of the world. And on the societal side, you can have these very conservative sectors of society, but at the same time, you have a very vibrant social movement. So a very vibrant civil society who also can be very progressive and very politically mobilized and aware and checking what's coming from politics, from Brasilia. So this is my point, that it's really a place of contrasts, things that can look contradictory, but they coexist with each other. And you have to try to understand these complexities to make sense of Brazil. Otherwise, you risk simplifying what's going on there and how this country works.
I love that. Thank you. That's so useful. I've absolutely loved your guiding principles that you've just set out for Brazilian foreign policy. We really appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Great British Foreign Affairs podcast, where Britain meets the world. Subscribe today, share it with a friend or colleague, and be part of shaping Britain's role on the global stage.